In this exercise, we're going to be showing you how to set up a Photoshop document to do some basic frame-by-frame animations. There's 3 sections to it. This will be the final one that allows you to morph one object into another, but we'll start off by doing a simple path, drawing a ball from one side to the other, as well as doing another path that has squash and stretch in it as well. So let's get started. To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Animation Paths folder that has a variety of different little paths that we're going to use to help animate through this exercise. Now for this one, we're going to be learning to animate using Adobe Photoshop. So make sure Photoshop is launched, and we'll start by creating a new document. The size of our document needs to be measured in pixels, and it's going to be 1920 by 1080. The resolution won't matter, but do make sure Artboards is unchecked and you can keep your background set to white. We'll say OK and create that. The next thing we need to do is make sure your timeline is visible at the bottom of your panel. If you don't see it, you can always go up to Window and down to Timeline, and this will launch the timeline down here at the bottom. Additionally, do make sure your Layers panel is open and active. Both the timeline and the layers work hand in hand, so you need to be able to see both of those. Now, to get started in making a frame-by-frame animation for this exercise, choose Create Video Timeline. Do be aware that there's also a frame animation option, but that's not what we want. So choosing this, we'll add a timeline to our document. The first thing that we need to do before we change anything else is to set our document's frame rate. And that can be found under the Timeline options. Down towards the bottom, choose Set Timeline Frame Rate. And we're going to change our timeline frame rate to 12 frames per second. This way we're not having to draw a bunch of frames every second that we have. The other thing to be aware of is notice that we have a layer 0 in our timeline and a layer 0 in our layers. So every time we add a layer to our timeline or otherwise, it's going to add on there too. If we want to see the amount of time, let's zoom in by clicking on the very bottom and open it up. By default, whenever you add new layers or new content to your document, it's going to give it a timeline of 5 seconds. And so whenever we do something new, just be aware that you may need to adjust the amount of time on it. Let's adjust the time for layer 0 down to 3 seconds by clicking on the edge and dragging it down to the 3-second mark right here. So now it's nice and set up with this. The next thing we need to do to make a set of frames is to create a video group. Click on the little film strip on layer 0 and let's choose New Video Group. This is going to add a folder to your Layers panel. Now inside of this group, if we click the Create New Layer icon at the bottom of your layer, this will add a new layer inside of here. We'll drag this off so we can see it a little bit better. Remember, automatically it's going to set it to be 5 seconds long. What we want to do to this first layer is to drag it to be 1 frame long. So I'm going to click on the very end and drag it all the way to the left until it can't go anymore. If it helps, you can also zoom in so that you can start to see the individual frames on your timeline. Now with this duration set to 1 frame and layer 1 selected, we can hold Command C to copy it and Command V to paste it. Notice now that it's going to add another frame directly after that. And so we're copying and pasting that initial frame, which is going to be blank, and we're going to simply do that until our entire timeline fills up with 36 frames or 3 seconds worth total. So there's layer 36 right there. Now the way Photoshop animation works is that we want to be able to draw inside of every layer which frame that we want. So it's going to be very helpful to know where your playhead is and also which frame or layer you have selected as you go to draw. To help out with this, I'm going to put my layers back where they need to be. In our timeline options, I'm going to enable onion skinning, which will show us what we drew before, and I'm also going to enable timeline shortcuts. These timeline shortcuts are going to allow you to use your arrow keys to move the playhead forward as well as if I hold down Option and the close bracket key, which is located underneath the delete key. So Option, bracket key will move forward or backwards if I do the open bracket key in our layers timeline, to move forward and backward with that. So the brackets with Option. Make sure you don't hold Command and the bracket keys. That will move your entire layer. For the first part of this exercise, let's go down to our Layers panel, click on Layer 0, and let's go up to File and Place Embedded, and locate that Animation Path 1 JPEG. When we say place, this is going to place inside of its own layer. We'll say OK to that. Remember, just make sure that it's below all of your frame layers and above layer 0. So we want it to be on its own separate individual timeline. Also, we need to scroll over and we need to set the duration of that new layer back to 3 seconds. So click and drag it down to 3. Now it's looking good working from here. For the rest of this time, we're going to practice drawing a simple circle, moving along each of the frames and having it move back and forth along this path. So super duper simple. Start off by selecting your paintbrush tool. With the paintbrush tool, we don't need the size of it to be very large, so I want to keep it around 10 or so pixels. Right about there looks good. Make sure the mode is set to normal, opacity and flow are set to 100%, and you can adjust your smoothing as necessary. I've also got red as my color, so when I draw off my circle, there it is set to there. So on my timeline, I've got the first frame selected and my playhead is set to 0 seconds. All I'm going to do is draw a simple circle right here, and I want to make sure the middle point lines up with the cross from there. If you make a mistake and need to redraw it again, simply either undo or erase it and have it set to that. Your circles don't have to look perfect. Next, down on our timeline, we're going to move the playhead forward and make sure to select the next keyframe, or the frame from here. Notice when we do this, the opacity of the previous frame kind of drops, and that allows us to see what we drew previously. As I draw my next circle, I'm kind of paying attention to make sure it's the same size. Now we can select the next frame and move forward. You can see how it still sees the last frame, but now I can't see the others. And go back and carefully draw off the circles for each frame. Repeat this process of moving forward and drawing off each of the circles, just trying to aim, letting the center point to be the center of the circle that you draw. Remember, you can also use your keyboard shortcuts of the forward arrow and Option close bracket to move forward for both of those as well. Then draw off the next one. Now that I've reached the end of this one, we'll still move forward to the next frame and simply return the animation back to the other side. Once you've done this, you can bring your playhead back, you can turn off onion skinning, and you can play it to see what it looks like. So there it is back and forth. Notice, however, once we reach the very end, it's going to disappear because we have extra frames left over, but we don't have anything drawn. So if you want, once you reach this last frame, you can move forward again and keep drawing the ball in the same location. So it's going to look like it's held in that same spot. Now, as you draw this off, of course your drawing is going to be off by just a little bit, so it's going to have kind of a squiggle effect as it pauses in this location. That's okay. That's all part of the animation aesthetic that we have. Just strive to keep the ball relatively the same size, so it's not getting any larger or smaller. It's just kind of wiggling and staying in the same spot for every time you draw with this one. Repeat this process until you finish out all 36 of your final frames. With this done, now we can render our movie. What we want to do is to go over to our Layers panel, scroll to the bottom, and let's turn off visibility for that animation path. This way all that we're seeing is just our little circles. Again, if you want to test it, you can press the space bar. You can see how it pauses and then jumps back and forth from there. So it's looking really good. To render your movie, go up to File, down to Export, and choose Render Video. This may take a second to load up, but once it does, you got several options to choose from. First off, give it a name. So I'm going to call this Animation Path 1. You can tell where you want it to save to. In my case, I've got the desktop selected. Make sure Adobe Media Encoder is selected, and you can keep your format at H.264. Everything else will be exactly the same as far as the document size and the frame rate. Click Render. Depending on the length of your animation, it may take a little bit of time, but once you're finished, it will save it up as a movie file that's on your desktop. This movie file is what you need to upload to the class page. Now let's create a new Photoshop document and do the second path. We'll close this document out. If you haven't saved it, you don't have to. Create a new file. Remember, the size of it needs to be 1920 by 1080. No artboards, and a background of solid white. We can create our new timeline. Before we do anything else, set your frame rate to be 12 frames per second. Say OK to that. We can zoom in, and let's set our time to be 3 seconds long for the duration. We'll go ahead and place that second timeline on there. So File, Place Embedded, choose Animation Path 2, and then in the keyframe or the film strip, let's add a new video group. Inside of this group, we need to add a new frame first. We can set both of these layers. Well, the animation path can be 3 seconds, but your frames need to be 1 frame long. I'm going to zoom in so I can see the individual frame to make sure it's set. With layer 1 selected, Command C to copy it, Command V to paste it, and simply press Command V to fill up the rest of your timeline until you get 36 frames total. And there it is, set to there. Next, we can make sure our playhead is set to 0 seconds and the first frame is selected. Also, I'll make sure my onion skinning is enabled, and I've also enabled my timeline shortcuts to make it simpler. Starting on this first frame, we're going to be animating the ball going up and easing in and easing out as it squashes and stretches for this jump. So we'll start off with a simple ball, but now as I move to the next frame, I want it to stretch out. So I'm going to let it stretch. And remember, as it stretches, it needs to retain roughly the same amount of volume. If you find that it's getting a little bit too big on one end, simply erase and redraw it. Now, as it's stretching and moving upward, we'll go to the next keyframe. It's going to become more and more circular again. So it's not as stretched out between both of these. I still want to keep my ball nice and centered inside the line. Oops, keeping it roughly the same size as it should be. Finally, when it reaches up here, it's going to be practically circular for each one. It's just not going to move as much. Make it a little bit bigger. And finally, we'll reach the center point from here. Next, if you want to test your animation, you can see how it's going to come up and ease in. And then finally, we're going to let it ease in and fall down to the next keyframes. Moving over a little bit. As it falls, keep in mind it's going to stretch out just a little bit. So by this point, it's starting to pick up momentum, and it's going to get a little bit smaller and a little bit more stretched out. This one a little bit more stretched out. This one will be the most stretched out. And then finally, when it lands on this keyframe, we're going to let it be squashed down, and then maybe spend another keyframe popping back up just a little bit more. So maybe for this one, it'll be slightly squashed, and then the next keyframe, it's completely circular. If we wanted to test this out, you can see how it lands and it squashes back up. Now all we need to do is animate it going back the other way. Moving forward to the next keyframe. Remember, when it pops up, we want it to stretch out. And then as it moves forward, we want it to become a little bit more circular until it finally reaches this top point and it's almost completely circular. As we did with the others, you're going to have several keyframes left over. So all you need to do is to keep drawing on the next keyframe. Whoops, let's go back one. And hold the circle in the same position. Once this is finished, you can turn off onion skinning and you can test your animation. Now you can see how it eases in and out, squashes and stretches as it moves. As we did with the others, let's go to File, let's go down to our animation path and turn off visibility for it. Now we can go to File and Export and render our video. Give it a name. This will be Animation Path 2. Everything else will remain the same, and we'll click Render. Once it's finished, you should have on your desktop another video that you'll upload to the class page. Finally, let's do the third animation path. We'll close this out. You don't have to save it. Let's create a new file. Again, the size of it needs to be 1920 by 1080. Background of white with no artboards, and we'll say Create. We'll create a new timeline. Set the frame rate to be 12 seconds long. Say OK to that. You can zoom in and set our timeline for layer 0 to be 3 seconds. Let's go ahead and import path 3. So File, Place Embedded. Here's path number 3. We'll set its timeline to be 3 seconds as well. And click on the film strip to create a new video group. Inside of this group, go over to your layers and let's insert a new layer. Set that layer to be 1 frame long. And I'm going to zoom in so I can see it. Oops, there we go. With that layer selected, Command C to copy it, Command V to paste it, and paste it on till you fill up 36 frames total, all the way to the end. Make sure frame number 1 is selected and your playhead is set to 0 seconds. For this animation, we're going to draw the ball transitioning along the path into a rectangle. As it follows along the path, you can have it morph and change its shape however you wish, and you can also add easing in and easing out. I do want the ball to be completely solid filled. So for this, with my first frame selected, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger, and I'm simply going to draw off the starting point for my circle. Your circle doesn't have to look 100% perfect. It's okay that if it's off by a little bit. Next, we'll move forward to the next frame. Do make sure your onion skin is turned on so that you can see what you drew previously. Now I'm going to move forward a bit more, and this time I'm going to have the ball kind of transition down into a more flat ball. Move to the next frame and move forward. As it moves forward, I'm going to have it slide out almost as if it was turning liquid. Next frame, move the ball forward, and again stretching out just a little bit more. Maybe this time as it stretches out, a little piece kind of breaks off at the end. Whatever you want to do for this, we'll leave it up to you. That piece needs to catch up a little bit more. Move forward. Since it's going to be easing in, I'm going to slow down the pace, let the tail get a little bit shorter, let the other little piece catch up to it, and then we'll have it kind of pause right here at the bend. So a little bit more, tail gets a little bit shorter each time. This is simply how I wanted to animate my drawing. If you choose to do something different, you're certainly welcome to transition it however you wish. But take it one frame at a time, completely filling everything in. With this part done now, we can turn off visibility for our path number 3. We'll also turn off onion skinning, and we can test our animation to see what it looks like. Finally, let's go up to File, down to Export, and render the video. We'll call this Animation Path 3, and click Render, and then finally upload this rendered movie file to the class page.